Dr. Sherry Berger here from VetVine this week with Olivia Vandegreek, who's joining us from the University of Georgia. Olivia, I want to welcome you and thank you for accepting our invitation to speak about your paper.
Thank you.
So, tell us who you are, a little bit about you, and what you're here to talk to us about today.
Yeah, definitely. So I am a current PhD student at the University of Georgia. I am not a vet, however. I'm studying industrial organizational psychology. And so we focus a lot on employee well-being, employee stress, career progression, and how to make workers happier and healthier and more productive, both for the employee and for the organization. And so sometimes we do studies that are focused specifically at certain industries when we notice that there's something interesting about an industry that needs digging into deeper. And so that is what I did. I worked with a team of colleagues, my faculty advisor, Melissa Clark at the University of Georgia, Meg Stabler and Amanda Moeller both helped a lot. And then also Dr. Randy Nett, who is a physician and epidemiologist at the CDC, and Dr. Tracy Witt, who is a clinical psychologist at Auburn University.
So, it's been said in the past veterinarians need data and statistics to drive home certain points. There's certainly been a lot of anecdotes, a lot of blogging, a lot of discussion in the profession about veterinary well-being, veterinarians' stress levels, burnout, compassion fatigue. So, can you give us a little bit of background about the study that you've done?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the purpose of the current study that we did was to fully understand and to be able to categorize the practice related stressors that are specific to veterinary medicine. And this question first emerged based on a problem that stood out to my team as really interesting and somewhat strange. And that's that veterinarians experience higher rates of suicide and depressive symptoms than the rest of the population. And this is a pretty startling fact, obviously, and it initially stood out to two of my co-authors, Randy Nett, who I mentioned, and Tracy Witt, as being a really interesting question. And so they conducted their own study a few years ago. It came out in 2015, and I highly recommend reading that too, to estimate the prevalence of risk factors for suicide and attitudes toward mental illness and practice-related stressors in this population. And so in their study, they actually interviewed over 11,000 vets from across the United States about their experiences with various risk factors for suicide and mental illness. And again, they found very high rates in this sample, which is startling, like I said before. And so that leads us to a bigger question, right? And that is, why is this happening? Why is this the case? What is it about being a vet that is causing these higher rates of mental illness and suicidal ideation? So as a part of their study, they asked participating vets to choose their top 3 stressors from a list of stressors that they provided. But they also provided an option where participants could write in their own response about their stressors. And they actually found that a really large number, about 13% of participants, chose to write in their own responses, which ended up giving them a huge qualitative data set of over 1,400 vets about what stresses them out at work. And so that's really interesting data right there in itself. So Dr. Nett and Dr. Witt reached out to myself and my team because we're industrial organizational psychologists and we study job stress, to help make sense of this job stress component and to figure out what all of these extra responses were saying and how to categorize what this vet stress is and what's going on with this population. We know this is a really important piece of the puzzle potentially in figuring out why vets have higher rates of mental illness, because we know that job-related stress can lead to employee burnout, and that ongoing interpersonal or emotional stress can result in exhaustion and cynicism and really just feeling ineffective at work. And in a more extreme vein, we know that work stress can be related to depression and suicidal behaviors. So with all of that said, it seemed that maybe these responses about what was most stressful to vets could hold some really important information and shed some light on what's potentially influencing these high rates of depression and suicidality that we see within this population. So taking all of these responses that we had, we developed our study to further examine the job stressors and ultimately to create a really comprehensive framework and taxonomy of practice-related stressors that are faced by vets that can be used in the future to better understand these problems. So the study that we conducted uses this data set of 1,400 vets' written responses about their top 3 stressors related to their job. And we used what's called rounded theory analysis. This is a general method of analysis that inductively develops theory and taxonomies from hard data from the ground up using a really iterative and rigorous process of coding. So we had a team of coders work on this and take every response that we had and go through them in code and ultimately categorize the framework that we came up with. So at the end of this process, we had a framework with 15 categories of stressors, which are broad, and house 40 subcategories within them. And if you take a look at the table within the paper itself, you can see the full list of categories and their subcategories. But I can talk about them briefly too here and some of the more common ones that we found. So for the broader categories, they encompass a lot more. So we found that the top were financial insecurity, client issues, coworker or interpersonal issues, and work-life balance. And these may seem broad, like I mentioned, and it may seem like these would apply to most professions, right? And it's true that they definitely do apply to a lot of professions in varying degrees. But where the really rich findings come in is actually with some of the subcategories. And so we found that the most common subcategories we had were clients being unwilling to pay for services, low income and often unexpectedly low income of vets, the cost of maintaining a practice or owning a practice, and government or state board policies that served as hurdles that vets had to overcome when they were just trying to do their job. So these are the most common ones. Like I said, you can see more of them within the paper itself and in the full table that we have there. But we think it provides a really interesting illustration, or at least a beginning of an illustration of what's going on with what vets are dealing with at work and what's most stressful to them. So I guess some key takeaways, what do we get from this, right? Besides just like a giant list of stressors that isn't necessarily helpful. But I think first and most immediately applicable as a key takeaway is that these results tell us what vet schools and what practices and what the professional community should really be taking into account when considering what stressors are facing their vets and the future vets on the job. So then the question really becomes, what can we do to help vets reduce these specific stressors? How can we target these stressors individually? What can the vet schools do to prepare their students for these realities? What can owners of practices do to help their employees? And how can vets be aware of these stressors themselves and learn how to manage them and combat them when they are dealing with them? So, for example, if we take the clients being unwilling to pay for services, right? Maybe vet schools can do more to help prepare their students for dealing with clients when clients are behaving this way. Another really common one we saw, like I said, was the cost of maintaining a practice. That was super common and seemed to be incredibly difficult for a lot of people. But what can schools and what can the professional community do to help people prepare for managing their own businesses? Because you see a lot of vets who received a classic vet school education, right? Then going on to run their own businesses without necessarily having any kind of business education. So how can the community help to provide resources to help people deal with this? How can schools incorporate this into their curriculum? And one really important resource, I think, are the social systems and resources within the professional community. We know that having a strong social network and support system can really help reduce a lot of the outcomes of mental illness and reduce stress as a whole. So how can organizations like VetVine, for example, provide resources for vets to help them manage these specific stressors, or just create a community of people facing the same issues so they can have a bigger and more supportive network and find some solidarity within their professional community? Also, I think from a researcher's perspective, this taxonomy provides a really solid and reliable foundation that researchers can now use to more closely examine the relationships between job stress and mental health outcomes in this population. Now that we have a more consistent and comprehensive source of job stressors in this population, which didn't really exist before, we can start to ask and test more causal questions and potentially interventional solutions that could be helpful. So I think this study really points to some really important conversations that should be happening within the community, the professional community, the research community, about potential solutions to this very real and very important problem.
Reading a lot of the individual comments that are listed in the paper, It definitely resonated with me. So many of them, from my practice career and having worked for years in veterinary hospitals.
Financial, I mean, that was huge, honestly. And there was so much about people specifically talking about how they felt like they couldn't retire, first of all, and how the return on investment wasn't necessarily as good as they thought it would be. They were still in debt. And so those were huge. And I think, honestly, it felt at points like people felt more stuck than anything rather than like, I want to leave. Now what? It was more like, when can I leave? Because I'm tired and I'm stressed out, but I feel like I can't retire. And I noticed that sort of actually conflicting too with such a love for the profession. It was like, I love what I do. I think it's meaningful work, but I also, it's not good for me anymore. So there was quite a bit of that.
Based on what you saw, obviously this lays at the foundation for education and training in the university level, right? For shaping the future of our profession. But for the practice owners who are out there, who are struggling either with business issues or to see all the issues that employees are dealing with, how would you advise them as how to use this information? What action steps would you suggest, if any?
So to a practice owner, I would probably suggest that they incorporate some kind of extra training for their employees, whether that is on client management or dealing with difficult clients, and have some kind of training where we know this is happening, we can all talk about it, be on the same page, and have a real system about how to go about dealing with that. I think that can be really helpful for employees. I think also having some kind of stress relief program within an organization, or just offering employees options or resources for maybe joining a gym or meditation, just to be aware so that when you're feeling stressed out as an employee, it's not necessarily like you have to hide it, but like, your bosses are aware of this, your supervisors are aware of the issues that you're facing, and you can deal with them more openly and not have to hide away from it. And that they actually then provide the resources for you to deal with that.
And what about the employee whose boss perhaps does not make it a priority for their workforce? How would you advise them?
That's a really important question. I think that all individuals, whether they're a vet or not, should have some kind of system for dealing with their stress. I think whether if you're at work and you're feeling like things are particularly difficult and you don't have that support system through your supervisor or through your coworkers, finding a system outside of that, because I do think that social support is one of the most important things, especially social support from other people who understand the issues you're dealing with explicitly. So whether that's finding a vet network or a group that you can go talk about it without feeling judged, I think that's really important. I think also practicing just mindfulness in your life, having something that works for you, whether it's meditation or exercising more or just eating right, figuring out what works for you to combat stress directly. And if you do have a support system, maybe talking about these issues and saying, man, I'm really struggling with my coworkers. How do you deal with yours? And just having this open conversation, I think is really important. I would encourage people to reach out to me with more questions. This is a really interesting topic, and I think that the interdisciplinary nature of this project too, we have physicians, we have clinical psychologists, we have IO psychologists working on it, but we actually didn't have any vets working on it. So I think getting the feedback from vets and hearing what you guys are actually thinking about and what you think might work could help a lot more research come out of this in the future, a lot more interventions come out of this, and potentially move the issue forward and hopefully find some solutions. So I encourage any correspondence. Thanks so much. I really appreciate this. This was a lot of fun.
Well, I thank you very much, and thanks so much for accepting the invitation, because this needs to be talked about, and something that the profession needs to embrace and act on. And I really thank you for joining us here today to talk about this.